Welcome to the Connected Campus podcast, where we explore the ways that diverse professionals are working every day to optimize their efforts to recruit, retain, and graduate their students.
I'm very excited for our conversation today. Folks who are familiar with Pathify, I think will recognize the face and or voice, I guess, depending on how you're listening to this episode. Dr. Kris Lee was featured in our one of our recent summits that we put on typically twice a year. And being somewhat new to the team, her reputation preceded her, and I got connected, and just very excited for this conversation around mental health and belonging for college students, just things that, especially given just the large sort of spotlight that's been put on this, and as we're sort of being able to kind of interface with and kind of get our arms around the particular issues, the things that are kind of working, we can kind of make space for that whole kind of conversation here today. So I'm very grateful to be having this conversation, but we'll start it as we always do. Dr. Kris, if you want to introduce yourself and give a brief overview of your professional background.
Sure, Dustin, it's so great to be with you and the entire Pathify community. As you said, we've just had a very meaningful connection through time and, really trying to advance this conversation around campus and global mental health, and specifically the crises that we have seen emerge not only during the pandemic and its aftermath, but even before. And, I've had the opportunity to be in the front lines of service really throughout my professional career. So I am a licensed independent clinical social worker. I am a behavior science expert. I teach and live at Northeastern University on the Boston campus. We have multiple campuses, and this has really just given me an incredible vantage point in terms of the pulse of students, faculty, staff, leaders, and what we all can do to be strategic about well-being during times of complexity and crisis.
Yeah, and I mean, and it's, trying to like find silver linings from this like just awful, unprecedented, sort of global event. And I think just like I said, sort of the light that is being shown on this, and it's thankfully, even kind of spilling over to just sort of like professional staff, on campuses, students, everything, just how we can create those environments for well-being. And, I think for students in particular, a big part of that is sort of community and belonging and all that. So we'll get into that, but I'm curious from your background, because you're trained sort of classically in this discipline of social work and counseling, everything like that. Like, was it always sort of an intention that you'd want to do that in the college environment, or was that sort of like a happenstance? Like, how did this sort of like come up? And certainly like your advocacy, I think, especially in this space, like how did that sort of like mature and evolve over time?
Well, I was really fortunate to be the first in my own family of origin to attend college. And, I attended Worcester State University. They were really formative years for me that really helped lead to a lot of perspective and upward mobility. But it also was a time when I was suffering very gravely with a mental health crisis that wasn't on my sleeve and wasn't obvious to those around me. And I had a professor who basically nudged me. She pulled me aside after class and said, "Are you okay?" Very simple words. I was absolutely mortified. I bolted out of that class as quick as I could. But once I stopped to think about it, I realized that I did need help and that it was okay not to be okay, but I didn't need to stay stuck. And so that allowed me to then get therapy. And when I had therapy for the first time, I realized, there was a lot renting space in my head that, had become really difficult, and I didn't have to live that way anymore. And that really set the stage, for my life's work in the space. And then, as I went on to get licensed and do outpatient mental health work, I saw trends of students coming in and, the classic students of today, high octane, highly perfectionistic, falling into the trappings of social comparison. And, I think sometimes that can deter from the beauty of education and what it can mean. In today's hyper competitive market, it can turn into a lot of things, a lot of definitions of so-called success that actually compromise well-being. And so, it started there with my own story and then led to the professional training. And then, the belief in the power of higher education and how it can transform us, but also how systemically there's a lot of change in the old school paradigms that we can sort of really invest ourselves in to make systems just what you had said, like a sense of psychological safety, a sense of belonging and community where there's less emphasis on performance and more emphasis on connection.
Yeah, and I think it's such an interesting thing is like, that's one sort of evolution over time. It's just like this issue, which is, certainly been existing for a long time, is just more apparent, and awareness, is just higher than it's ever been. But like, uh, I think that kind of what you're getting at too, which I think we'll get into a little bit later, but just that perfectionism, the competitiveness, and all that. Like, I think
Mhm.
that's probably gotten worse over time as society has just sort of made college the default option or different like it's just kind of like, well, you got to do this because you got to get the job, and you got to, it's like there's so much of sort of like, well, you're on the tightrope, and if you fall off, like you're just a waste of space and whatever else, and it's just like, so kind of high stakes and everything, versus it being like, hey, if you want to go to a coding boot camp for 10 months, like go for it, get a 2-year degree and do something else, like like, and there's sort of like less pressure on this sort of like kind of conformity or anything, because I think that conformity, those stakes kind of are conducive to people feeling much more kind of stressed out and anxious and whatever else. But
Mhm.
and it's one of those things where, like you said, it's like, psychological safety is sort of the like kind of main denominator here, I guess, because it's like, yeah, community and belonging is a big piece of that, and then it's certainly like enough, kind of accessible support resources, a lot of different things, but like safety to me, I guess, is always meant where it's like, it's not as if you're sort of immune or you're never going to have any problems and all that. It's like you kind of have a sense of like, whatever's going to come up, I can handle it or something. Like I
Mm.
always think of it in
Mm.
that way, to where I think there are people who sort of chastise that sort of like, that sort of coddling, where it's like, oh, are we going to like, everybody's got emotional support animals or whatever. I was like, everybody should have whatever they need within reason and
Uh-huh.
everything. Like reasonable accommodations is certainly the name of the game in any sort of educational setting. Is just, people shouldn't have any, barriers to pursuing their education. There's a lot of sort of permutations to that, but the main focus of our conversation is certainly on the community and belonging, because I think a lot of the other things sort of become a lot easier. Somebody's going to be a little
Mhm.
bit more motivated, likely to just persist in their studies, maybe access resources, get involved, kind of find themselves in everything. And um, to focus in on that portion of it, how do you see kind of community and belonging, inclusion, whatever kind of word you might want to use, how do you see that kind of playing into college student well-being?
I think it's everywhere we turn, and ultimately in the last 10 years, we've seen perfectionism go up by 33%. And the driving force is social comparison. And the fastest growing anxiety spectrum disorder is social anxiety. So if we're talking about connection, we need to talk about all that fear and trepidation to even like begin, dipping the toe in the water around social interaction. We've seen a lot of students self identify as feeling very awkward and feeling like social skills are rusty. And, that there's such like this influx of technology interaction that what does communication mean now? And so, I think when we look at those disruptors um, and saboteurs of connection, that can be beneficial. And I think, when you talk about like how you think about safety, I think it relates a lot to the resilience conversation. And I think even resilience now is becoming trite. It's becoming overused. Like you said, for some, there's a connotation of coddling. Um, or I think there's also like a romanticization of it. Like, so what I mean by that is like, well, just be gritty and pull yourself up by your bootstraps and suck it up and don't let anyone see you sweat until, unless it's to show off your hot yoga class. So I think, there's a lot of misinformation about what it means to feel connected and to feel resilient. And when we look at data as well, it's, people are saying that loneliness is the new smoking as a health risk, and so I think what we have to do is really look at, what helps foster a sense of belonging and connection. And I think a lot of it is just naming that none of us, when we feel this way, are the only ones. And I have seen that time and time again in my work and in my own life with my own lived experience. The biggest lie that anxiety and depression can tell you is that you're the only one, and it can become very isolating. And then obviously, like one of the tasks, at least, for maybe students in that 18 to 22-year-old category, if we're thinking about that cohort, it's like the first time living from home and you were used to like a whole ecosystem and now you're creating a whole new community. So that's a tall order, particularly during these times. And then what we also know is across the board, graduate students, students of all ages and levels, are also under the throes of this campus and global mental health crisis, whether they're virtual students or they might not live in a residence hall, but we're all seeing a lot of risk factors associated with this. And I think, again, given the fact that there's so many competing priorities at hand and a lot to overcome, a lot of trauma to overcome, we can automatically feel disconnected. Even if there's a lot of people around us, we can even feel more isolated because our own identities and our own ability to voice our struggles may be stifled.
Yeah, and that I'm kind of curious and something I saw recently, and it's escaping me where I exactly saw it, but like, so that it really doesn't matter, I guess. But the idea of like kind of almost like the conformity and the stuff that I was kind of mentioning, and even kind of to your points you're making there, sort of like just kind of just blending in and just sort of going with the flow and whatever else, like that, the opposite of sort of finding belonging sort of authentically and all that sort of meaningful connection with other people isn't necessarily isolation. It's maybe like sort of bifurcated. It could be like where you're literally alone, you're like not leaving your room or, your apartment or wherever else. It could be where you are around people all the time. You're out in the world. You're sort of almost like
Yeah.
performing sort of, being outgoing or whatever else, but you're not being authentically yourself. Or you're not able to sort of
Mm.
feel like people are actually sort of supporting you in a meaningful way. Like, do you have any thoughts around that, of that idea that like so much of this is sort of maybe the uh, kind of performative stuff, or like the kind of really true core that we're striving towards is people finding a kind of authentic, meaningful community, not just sort of like, yeah, you showed up and we're a wallflower for the whole time. Like, some people might be like, wow, we had so many people that showed up to this event, like so great, but it's like, did people actually like get anything out of it? Or were they just sort of like sitting around and just like talking about the weather or something? Like, was that maybe that was good, maybe that was enough, but like, I don't know. So like, any thoughts about that, or like actually kind of more meaningful, kind of authentic community?
I think it's a great question. I think we need to ask ourselves a lot of questions around along these lines, like what makes for a meaningful interaction. And again, when we look at that sense of being authentic or a sense of belonging, this is an aspect of my research and resilience, looking at identity and having that safety of experience that we can be our full selves without fear of punishment or scrutiny or being othered or discriminated against. And I think, that's an essential component, beyond, like you said, just sort of like something that like is very glamorous or like for the Instagram take, but someone feels like they really can't contribute or their voice isn't represented or heard. And so that's a lot of the focus of the work, that I do, not only on my own campus but really around the world as I consult with organizations, because what I hear amongst faculty, staff, and leaders, is a lot of concerns about students' well-being, and looking again to like what kinds of meaningful activities and levels of engagement can we offer that will allow, mitigation of the loneliness factor and will create that deeper sense of belonging and togetherness, amongst a campus community.
Yeah, I mean, and it sort of builds towards my next point, because I think the idea of something you speak a lot about, and like is sort of built into your research and things like vulnerability, bravery, and all that. Like, that is part of it, because I think if people are sort of shallowly, engaging on social media or everywhere else, like, yeah, like it just might count for numbers and all that, and make like staff or some administration leader feel satisfied or happy and whatever, and they're sort of like maybe taking their hands off a little bit. But I think that's kind of what's rattling in my mind too, is that like we might just sort of dump a bunch on like students who are all, they're going through a major transition in their life of entering into higher education, and like you said, certainly depending on their age, maybe the first time they're living away, but certainly the new norm is these are increasingly adult learners juggling a lot in their life. So even if it's like, maybe I tried college once, or I did go for 2-year degree at a community college and all that, like you might assume that they're better equipped to handle things. But I think what I'm thinking of is like certainly like intentionality and uh sort of strategy around like the tools that you're using, sort of the spaces that you create or things like that. But yeah, because I think that there's yeah, just a tendency where like, if they're digital natives and everything else, it's like you do need to sort of like try to like, uh have people understand, like you said, like one, they're not alone because like, social media is going to cause sort of a warped interpretation. So it's like that digital literacy of how to navigate those platforms, how to utilize things like, if you have Slack or if you have like, other sort of digital community building spaces, like how you can kind of uh, feel comfortable using them in sort of an authentic, vulnerable kind of way or anything. But that, yeah, like I think that is kind of part of it is the vulnerability and the bravery of sort of saying like, here's what I'm going through, like, and putting that out there because I think it ends up being that you will benefit and others will too. Like if you can sort of
Mm.
balance those two things, like being brave, sharing your vulnerability, or however you kind of want to, sort of put those together. But yeah, like it's such an interesting environment because, like you said, like the education environment is so unique where this should be the place where people are kind of figuring it out and hopefully figuring it out together, like kind of working through the stressors and the demands of juggling their academics and life and, uh, finding their identity and what else. So all that to say, I guess the core question, like I think intermixed and sort of just the way to build authentic community is you do need to kind of be vulnerable. You need to like put yourself out there and feel as though, yeah, you have maybe that sort of safety to
Mhm.
do that. So I guess like how do you see sort of the vulnerability, bravery sort of concepts playing into this sort of college student well-being and community belonging kind of conversation?
Well, one thing I advocate for is banning the 1950s hangover. So, what I mean by that is moving away from the old school stigmatized mental health condition for people over there that have these issues to human condition. And this really honors modern brain science, which says that all of us are likely to vacillate in and out of episodes across our lifespan. It's not just sort of like reserved for the few. So, when we as educational communities really normalize this level of response to environment and really reframe it not as like the way we used to see it as like is it a moral failing or is it just like an individual struggle when we see the systemic lens of again the campus and global mental health crises. It helps us, I think, be more compassionate with ourselves and with one another. And that can lead to more candid, brave conversations. So to your point, when what we know from the research, for example, is that, psychoeducation is important, like, again, understanding the complexity of mental health, understanding the different lenses in which we can, evaluate it, but also that peer support is what really helps provide a level of accountability and momentum. So, if we're encouraging candor, right? If we are encouraging levels of bravery and openness and honesty and authenticity, then, and I've seen this happen, I'm thinking back to a talk I gave some very high octane grad students. And it was pretty quiet in the room until one of the students said, when I first came to the US, I was so hard on myself. I had a lot of pressure from my family of origin, and I really, was just like classic straight A student. And they said I had such difficulty that I finally accessed treatment, and I went and saw a therapist, and it really helped me. And like you could hear a pin drop for like a hot second, and then it was like this huge collective sigh of relief. Hundreds of students like, thank God he said that because so many of us are feeling that same way, like imposter syndrome stuff, or feeling scared or overwhelmed or like overstimulated or anxious or like sleep deprived, like all the things that we all experience in this day and age. By the way, the World Health Organization reclassified burnout pre-pandemic. So they used to say that it was a condition of health, like a health categorization. Then they switched it to a condition of the modern workplace and of modern living. So like it's sort of like one of those things. It's a farce to think like, I'm the only one that's suffering. It's just that again, we're living in a time in which people can really curate that outside presentation. And that's why I advocate for a universal precautions approach in the college mental health conversation. a couple ways we can think about it. You can't, sometimes I'll even say it's the straight A student with like the perfectly curated Instagram feed and answers and like, those are the students sometimes I worry about because they look okay based on our old definitions of okay, and you just don't know what's going on. And I think the other thing that we need to talk more about in higher education is the burnout factor being the highest proportion for educators. So it's the classic Dick Elmore out of Harvard used to say, you know, doing the work of education is like trying to fly the airplane while fixing it, in flight. And I'm like, now there's no seatbelts on the plane, there's no snacks in sight. It's been like, this endless ride. It's so turbulent. And so we also have to be more expansive in how we talk about faculty burnout, leadership burnout, staff burnout, retention in the age of anxiety, the great resignation, and quiet quitting. And we have to really, again, normalize those conversations across the ecosystem that we all benefit from good mental health hygiene, for example. We all benefit from stopping and redefining definitions of success. No one's going to be at your funeral and say, oh, they had 1,476 followers on LinkedIn, or, ooh, they answered their email in 0.01 seconds. Weren't they the greatest? Like, that's not our legacy. So I think when we become clear about our values and when we recognize that we don't want to become another burnout statistic and that the work is arduous and it's fraught and it's complex and it's also beautiful and there's so many opportunities at hand, I think that begs us to this collective action, that we can do better and we must do better because, they're calling burnout inevitable, for example. And I think, one thing I always, whenever I had the opportunities to speak to educators, I always say, you're doing enough, because that's the burning question every educator asks themselves in this day and age. Am I doing enough? Everyone's officially worried about their students. We're all doing the work of multiple people. And it just feels like there's a lot at stake. And so, to that end, I think if we can have vulnerable conversations across the whole ecosystem, that can be a tremendous relief and that can help forge really important pathways to healing. Because if we don't just see it as like, oh, there's just a few people suffering and we'll just have this like service over there for them, I think we can really open up a lot of possibility within our ecosystems.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, a lot of powerful and important stuff there. Like, and that one of those just sort of simple core premises that I think has to click in for institutional leaders is like, if your faculty and staff are like happy and supported and all that, like they're going to have sort of that emotional bandwidth to at least sort of like try to chip away, especially, that kind of hard outer shell for those sort of high achievers and all that, because they're going to be like, yeah, it's good because they're just sort of like, running hot and that's just what they're used to and how they think it's always supposed to be. And they can kind of like not just ask like, hey, you doing all right? Like, and they might be like, yeah, I'm good. Like, all right, well, I'm here. They might kind of like, dig a little bit deeper to just be like, so like everything good at home, like you're juggling everything. Okay. Like ask a couple follow-up questions because they can sort of like, not feel like they themselves are like, I can't even fathom like, asking someone in depth, like how they're actually doing. So it's like you have to create that very cohesive entire kind of campus culture that everyone, feels as supported as possible. And because I'm even thinking like, because the kind of the core question like vulnerability and bravery and stuff, and that example which I love of like that one brave person who was like, hey man, I need some help and this is what I'm doing, and other people being like, yeah, me too. And that's such a like awesome like community building thing, is like one brave soul goes out and starts dancing and then everybody else starts joining, and it's like, yeah, nobody would have done it unless somebody did, and you did it, and that's amazing, and thank you so much. So like because yeah, I mean like there's so much too of like all this kind of stuff, and I'll just sort of try to like honor all the things that I was sort of like thinking about here, or all the things that you shared, because like how such a core part of your story was sort of had a wrinkle here of sort of like a faculty member who likely felt kind of well enough sort of to reach out and sort of tap someone on the shoulder and ask like hey, you doing okay and everything. So it's like that kind of bravery or sort of kind of just empathy, I guess, of doing that. Because I'm remembering too, like I started therapy in college. Like that's the first time I ever did it. I don't even remember why I started, but like it had to at least have been uh just an environment that made it very accessible. And I think like I was probably like, oh, I'll give it a shot. I don't know. We'll see how it's going, whatever. They had like doctoral students or graduate students who were like trying to get hours and all that, but like it was amazingly beneficial, and that was the beginning of, you know, a decades long or longer journey of sort of just like it doesn't have to be this hard. Like you don't have to go it alone. Like you can have this space even when, you know, good times are rolling. It's like, yeah, you could just kind of, you know, talk about that and work on things, whatever. So it's like, uh whether it's just very internal and it's very individual, and whether you're, you know, sharing that out, hopefully people feel empowered to do that, especially in these environments where you almost would be surprised if somebody was like, I'm completely okay, I have no problems whatsoever, I, you know, no help or whatever. It's like, no, I think the college environment across the board, like people are going to be in varying levels of just sort of stress, anxiety, you know, and everything else. I think it's sort of the, and this is how I've started to kind of describe it, is like, yeah, there's going to be an occasional sort of storm front of, you know, for one reason or another, where it's just like, I'm kind of depressed. I'm kind of bummed out. Like, I'm just really having a hard time. And, you know, maybe it was sort of a shipwreck moment, kind of really set me off. And I've been kind of trying to claw my way back here. But it's like, to sort of build towards my next question, because I think there's like an interesting sort of opportunity here, is like translating this sort of vulnerability and bravery idea of, certainly a lot of students are, you know, sort of augmenting their community building through digital tools and spaces and everything. And I'm thinking of like, you know, say you're using Slack or Teams or anything else, or, you know, like setting a status, it's like just letting people know, it's like, hey, I'm taking a mental health day or something, like, hey, I'm having a hard time, or like, hey, you know, then just like kind of normalizing that idea of like, we need to be fighting against like very purposely and publicly that just like noise and everything that's just sort of causing kind of burnout to always be sort of you know, inching towards us. So just any thoughts on how, because I think the notion is that like, you know, digital spaces or social media or whatever else is like just a problem, but I feel like there can be
Mhm.
potential for a lot of good sort of community building, especially for college students using these tools.
Well, indeed, and for so many too, it's kind of like their native literacy, you know, like, and so I think sometimes, like generations might say, "Oh, like that's not how to communicate. Like it's only face to face, or it's only this particular way." And when we even look at some of the data around therapy efficacy, I think a lot of people, maybe in an older school tradition, might say like, "No, it should be in person." And I've even kind of favored that. I've leaned in that direction, but there's not necessarily a ton of data that supports that idea either. And so I think that we have a lot of things that we can lever to create community. I think that, you know, what I've seen, even, you know, so I've done, you know, full gamut of teaching, you know, hybrid, fully in person, fully online, and you just see different things being reported. Like, so for example, for some students, when it's just purely 100% online, they may be more inclined to participate versus being in a classroom and speaking out. That would be very anxiety provoking. So, you know, we just see a lot of different variables affecting interaction. And I think that these tools are really vital. You know, they do create access. We are dealing with, when it comes to therapy, at least, a critical shortage of mental health workers by 2030. That was again being projected before the pandemic. A lot of us were very concerned about that. And so anything that we can do to, you know, create access and provide, you know, the tools that are evidence based, that are of science. I think that's another, you know, I always say in my work that sloppy thinking is a public health issue. And that's something that I really try to embody in my work as a scholar practitioner. And all the work I'm doing in higher ed is to really encourage the skills of critical thinking. You know, there's a lot coming at all of us that we have to decipher. And like in the realm of mental health information or resilience hype, you know, there's a lot of pop psychology. There's a lot of stuff coming through feeds, a lot of toxic positivity or motivational Monday stuff. And, you know, that stuff kind of just is very underwhelming and it's erroneous. I got, you know, I'm kind of fascinated by TikTok culture. And I saw that a recent study revealed that 86% of the most viral how to videos on TikTok were seen to be either erroneous or harmful. You know, so I think like it's incumbent within higher education, you know, as learned people, as scholars and practitioners, you know, to really take a lot of leadership and assert a lot of agency around how we can get people to unlearn and relearn. Or another way to put it would be to rethink what they've been sold and what they're being fed all the time. because a lot of it is actually quite harmful and and counter to our well-being. And I mentioned a couple examples like definitions of so-called success, right? Or um, why someone might be experiencing a mental health crisis. Sometimes it's, like I know when I did my clinical training, they always say like rule out medical. Sometimes it's like a thyroid issue or like so there's so many reasons, or like it could be sleep deprivation or just loss, or it could be trauma. And the thing I always say is help helps, getting evaluated by someone that has the capacity through their licensure and their expertise to really help you make sense of things, and then set a strategic plan for recovery and healing. And that's something that really encourages me. I think there's a lot to be said about defining the problem, but we have incredible resources today. We have incredible knowledge to tap into and to use, and I think that's part of normalizing the conversation too. Like for me, when I came out with my own mental health story, I was lead faculty for behavior science. A lot of people looked to me in my leadership, and I came out in a pretty vivid way in front of all my peers. I went on to talk about this in my TEDx talk, "The Risk You Must Take." And when I first did it, I felt good about it initially, like this is the right thing to do as an activist and as an expert in this area. Like, let's just call it what it is, and there's no need to hide. But I did go through a little bit of that, like, oh dear, did I just like, are people going to start watching me, or am I going to face some form of stigmatization? But it had the opposite effect ultimately. Speaking of community connection and belonging, I felt safer through that disclosure. I felt really comforted, for example, when colleagues would say, "That's exactly how I felt, but I was afraid to say it," or "Thank you for saying that." That really helped me, kind of come to terms with my own peril and recognize that I didn't have to stay stuck either. So, I think those are really critical pieces, and there's a lot we can leverage in our modern world. But I think ultimately, setting the boundaries around constant screen sucking, as I call it, making sure we're getting in nature, make sure we have a diverse tapestry of interaction, and there's no one size fits all formula. But if you think you're spending a ton of time not interacting in the flesh, then, maybe see if you can chip away and change that step by step. And then see what that feels like. Like, make it a bit of an experiment and see what kind of momentum and traction is gained. Because, I think a lot of us in the pandemic, it took, when we think about like anxiety, for example, and social anxiety, and any kind of like intrusive thoughts, or even like OCD spectrum, any of those things, the tried and true treatment is exposure therapy, getting comfortable with the uncomfortable. And that's why I talk about microdosing bravery in my work. I don't say go out and, think you're going to like do this grand gesture. Do something small and integrate the discoveries that come with that. And so those principles, those clinical and research driven principles, are really important at this moment in time, because it takes a while to come through trauma. Like, you don't just have a flip a switch and bounce back. And we're not like gritty like sandpaper all the time, and like we're not robots and machines, right? We're not human doings, we're human beings. So like this is a process, and I think that's something I teach constantly, is that resilience is a process. It's not a trait, it's a process that we can endeavor as humans in order to stay and do well.
Yeah, I mean that's a lot of awesome perspectives, because I think like the big sort of thing in my mind, because like you were kind of mentioning, like there can be just a lot of junk out there, just in terms of like social media platforms and what they're sharing, and you know they unfortunately tend to kind of reward that. But like, yeah, for institutional leaders, like trying to make sure you're doing some basics of digital literacy, because it's like they're going to be on there and that's fine. But like, one is just like interpreting, using critical thinking, the information you're seeing there. But then also, like you're saying, it's like just try to like be very mindful and like listen to yourself. Like if there's, if you've, I think people kind of naturally kind of get to points where they're just like, "Ah, I feel like I'm on my phone too much," and they'll just sort of like spin their wheels, or sort of like, not really go anywhere. But it's just like, okay, I'm going to intentionally start to kind of like, yeah, like microdose it, going outside or taking a walk, or,
Mhm,
if it's
mhm,
like, all right, if I'm going to, do homework or sit around, do whatever, it's like maybe I'll sit in a lounge, maybe I'll sit in the library, maybe I'll be in the coffee shop. And it's like, that could just be that sort of like thing where it's like, if you're just
mhm.
going to be like doing whatever, you might as well maybe try to do it out in the world, if you're starting to feel as though you're just like sort of baking your brain on just like constant scrolling on TikTok. Like, and I feel like that's the worst platform I've ever seen. Where it's like I use it and it is great, but it is the worst for just like time suck and all that. You're just like, well, hold on a second, like,
Yeah.
where am I? What's going on? Whatever. So it's like, yeah, like try to like listen to yourself, moderate, is sort of a what I always fall back on. But like, yeah, there's a place for these digital tools for like access. Cause I'm thinking kind of what you're saying, where like so many institutions, their counseling centers and everything are going to be so overclocked. If there's just ways, like kind of on ramps for intake or for even just sort of texting to kind of like, get people
Mhm.
started and starting somewhere to kind of like, not have people feel as though it's like, well, it's not even worth it to try to even, start or reach out or see whatever. It's like, well, we can at least sort of see where you at, what could be most helpful. And if it is sort of even like your preference or, you know, uh, considering what you're going through, and in-person talk therapy is really going to, I think, be the most helpful. Or it could just be like, do you just want somebody to like text every once in a while to like kind of, get
Mhm.
stuff out of your
Mhm.
head? Like, is medication going to be the answer? And we can try to put you in touch with like, somebody who's going to be able to sort of, evaluate what's going to be helpful there. So like, I think, yeah, there's definitely a place for these digital tools and digital spaces for people to, students even to like kind of just like carve out their own like, channel on Slack or Discord to kind of talk about their interests, or, to be able to kind of throttle like, because you can mute those things easily, or you can kind of like be like, you know what, I'll jump in there when I feel capable and ready. Like I don't have to like be in the room where it happened. Like, and if I missed it, it's like, well, no, they like recorded that lecture or that speaker. I'll watch it on demand later, or I'll like see what everybody was talking about when I like, sort of have the bandwidth to do that. So I think uh it just, yeah, has to be very thoughtful. It has to be, you know, done with sort of strategy and teaching students digital literacy to kind of, yeah, to sort of create that healthy balance for everything. But uh I imagine, and we'll certainly link out to just, all of your stuff and the TEDx talk and Spring Summit stuff and everything else. But I imagine you might have some good resources to share. So I wanted to make some space as we're winding down for anything that you'd want to kind of give a tip of the hat to include the show notes for this episode.
Indeed, and so on my website, I have a lot of resources, as you mentioned. And I love to talk to folks about my stress resilience and behavior change course at Northeastern, because there's a lot of things that can kind of be broken into activities and, guides for those in institutions who are really trying to build this healthy mental health culture. And then you may know of my deep involvement with Active Minds, a collaboration we've all done in the past. Phenomenal nonprofit with a host of tools, including everything from the gamut of crisis intervention and the immediate throes of crisis, to just everyday practices. So I definitely want to give a shout out to my Active Minds fam, and also to my Northeastern community. I always say I learn more from my students than I could ever teach them, and I'm really grateful to be in community with such amazing students and colleagues. And speaking of community, I feel such a sense of belonging here. I've lived on campus the past 3 years. I'm getting ready to move off soon, which is very bittersweet. And I think our relationships ultimately serve as such protective factors in our lives. So I definitely hope folks will connect and be strategic in how they think about instituting these things in their own respective environments. And Dustin, it's been such a pleasure, connecting with you and the entire Pathify community. You're all doing extraordinary work. You keep using the word intentionality, which I think really embodies, everything that you're all setting out to do and to embody. So, yeah.
I appreciate that very much. And yeah, I mean, just even to what you're saying in terms of like resources, I know there's like, courses just like out there on like positive psychology and all that, like just those sort of learning
Yeah.
environments where, you're learning as much from your students, and those sort of things are just sort of doing some kind of formal learning around all this stuff is certainly time well spent. So, but
Indeed.
we will end with our final question that we ask all of our guests. So, what does a connected campus look and or feel like to you?
It feels a place where people can be themselves and they can, develop strong relationships across the ecosystem. So they have a diverse range of folks with shared and different interests that they can connect with, and where that they can really learn to be active contributors in today's world.
Beautiful. Great way to end an amazing episode, amazing conversation. Thank you so much, Dr. Kris, for sharing all that you did and all the great work that you do in this space. And like I said, we'll have ways to connect with you and everything that you mentioned in the show notes. So, yeah, just have a great rest of your day.
You as well. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to The Connected Campus. Please leave a 5-star review for the show and share it so others can discover us. Make sure to also subscribe so you never miss an episode. Thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you in the next episode of The Connected Campus.